Okay, I've been working on some side notch points with natural materials, with abo tools, and I'm not sure if I actually saved these videos. Anyway, I'm going to try for uh, more narrow and deeper notches than this. These notches are pretty deep on the day sight, but they're not very narrow. And this is raw Georgetown. I couldn't get deep notches with this. I also started with a pretty thick preform, so what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to go back to the day sight. I don't have real thin blade-like flakes. I've got some spalls that was given to me by a friend of mine named Jesse, and he wanted me to nap these on film, and I had some other requests too. A few people asked me to nap some day sight. I think this is obsidian here. Anyway, I don't have real thin blades, so I'm going to have to start with kind of large chunks for the type of arrowheads I'm working on. Relatively large pieces. And there's more of a chance of messing up during the video when you've got a lot more to do, but I'm going to try this again. I was having some difficulty earlier with thinning during the later stages. Of course, that's always difficult, but I haven't worked day sight in a long time, and it can be kind of quirky. I mean, it crushes really easily on the edges. I mean, it flakes beautifully, even better than heat-treated stone. Most heat-treated stone, anyway. But it'll cause a step fracture on you right when you don't need it. And you know, similar to obsidian, but obsidian seems a little more flexible than this. The good quality obsidian, anyway. A lot of obsidian is extremely brittle, and you can just barely tap it on the ends and it'll snap in the middle. Whereas other obsidian, you can really strike it hard and nothing will happen as far as bending breaks or end snap. So you can tell if a material is not very brittle, if it'll hold up to a lot of end thinning without end snapping. Yeah, end thinning without end snapping means you have a flexible material, because it can flex instead of snapping in the middle when you're hitting on the ends. Okay, so at this stage with copper, I would normally, thin it out fairly quickly with indirect percussion. But there's a slightly different strategy with natural materials, at least with me. I gotta try to reduce this with direct percussion as much as I can first, and then go to everything else. I used to do that too with indirect percussion, but now I tend to use indirect percussion for all stages. Sometimes even for knocking flakes off to work with as work pieces. I am going to use indirect percussion with antler on this, Seems to work well so far. I used it on some of the other pieces that I was working on earlier. So yeah, if I already had flakes made, I wouldn't have to go through the stage of trying to biface this down and thin it down. And have stuff like that happen. It's still a pretty good size. I can still use this. And I guess I had a request, or several requests, for working day sight, because it seems like it flakes extremely easily, but then you get down to the final finishing and you probably end up with some really thick points that, wonder why they're so thick when the material is so easy to nap. So I'm going to try to thin this down as much as possible. I can probably get it pretty thin. Let's see, with a little billet here, if I can find it. Yeah. And then use indirect percussion to thin it down further. Seems to respond really well if you peel the flakes off instead of driving them in. Just kind of, peel downward instead of driving inward. I'm driving in like this. I'm not holding it like this. Just trying to catch it with the flat end. Those little areas sticking out. Now the problem with really easily flaked material is that it tends to get narrow, really fast. So you have to try to preserve your edge, and it crumbles away easily. That's the hard part. You've got to make good platforms, which cost material, and then when you strike it, it flakes so easily that it removes a lot of material, and again, you're losing quite a bit of your edge. So edge preservation is the key with this kind of stuff, which means you have to be very careful with each and every strike. And if you produce a step fracture in this, a lot of times you can come in from the other side, but then a lot of times it'll overshoot. It'll remove a lot. Instead of just skimming over the top of that step fracture, just remove the whole side, and they don't want that either. This material easily overshoots. That platform is almost not low enough. Well, probably is not low enough. And you get this kind of bulb of percussion a lot with dacite. And obsidian too, I guess. But especially with this particular batch, I'm getting a lot of these. And getting this kind of crushing is okay at this stage when it's nice and big, but when you get toward the end and you want to thin a very thin piece and you get this kind of crushing, it becomes very narrow very quickly and it gets frustrating. You end up with a thick, narrow piece that you could have easily made without going through all this trouble, just by pressure flaking a thick piece and get down to a thin, or get down to a narrow, thick piece. So yeah, edge preservation is the key thing. It does carry a flake really nicely though. I mean, you can just barely hit it and it'll run a flake. As long as the platform is good. And the edge is just right to catch your tool, to support the tool. It's hard for me today to stay in the frame. I made a video earlier, but it really stunk. I kept going out of the frame. Yeah, see, that's no good. I mean, the platform seems perfect, and then you hit it wrong, and it's easily crushed. Then you try to beef it up, and then you end up hitting way too hard and snapping everything. See that? It's a little bit too strong, and it's just chewing on the end of my antler. Yeah, accuracy is definitely the key here. try pressure flaking that edge to see if I can fix it up a little bit for the next series of thinning flakes, or for the next batch. I'm not going to do them in series. I'll be probably be using a lot of pressure on this one since it's so easy to pressure flake, but for the most part I use pressure for a convenient way of preparing for percussion. And Daysite abrades extremely easily. So I got to be careful there, not to get it too dull. Now this is really large for what I need to be doing, but oops, I'd rather have it a little bit oversized than undersized. Hopefully I won't mess up at the last stage of thinning. I'm trying to drive these flakes inward and I'm getting a lot of crushing. I think that flake wanted to dive in. This one here. From here, I think it wanted to dive in. I'm glad it didn't go very far. It makes me nervous hitting that hard on the end. But for some reason, some of these platforms release really easily and some don't. And the ones that don't seem to be the ones that look perfect. It could be that, I'm just not hitting it hard enough because I think they're perfect platforms, don't need much effort. But I do kind of need to be aggressive to get this thinned, as with any other piece. It's difficult to thin anything if you're holding back, although you do have to be extremely careful during the final stages. Yeah, lots and lots of crushing there. I've got to peel these flakes off instead of driving them. I got to make sure there's not too much mass ahead of these flakes either. Looks like I have to use a very small point of contact. I'm switching over to a larger mallet with more velocity. So I need a smaller point of contact with more velocity. I was using this smaller mallet, but it looks like I'll need a lot more velocity. I think that actually overshot that one there. when I switched over to the new billet. To the new mallet. It's not really a good sign. Okay, let's see if I can get anywhere with the pressure here. And I'm just going to clean this up. Yeah, it already feels really crushy. I almost feel like I should stop right there and just make a arrowhead out of this, but I'm going to try to get this a lot thinner and then do some deep basal notches on this. I'm just going to take down that edge because I need to be a lot more narrow anyway. Oops. Sorry about that. I'm going to back right up into that step fracture. If it doesn't eat my antler first. Yeah, much better.